We're here, aren't we, for a conclusion, but of course that's an illusion. This is only the beginning. We in Australia have just passed laws, for example, which allow for the collection of metadata. We're only at the beginning of this conversation. We can only imagine into the future what the collection of metadata will be, where it will come from. What then can I offer you, given that we are at the beginning? I can only offer reflections on possible metaphors, lenses, ways of looking at this, which are going to be particularly adapted or future-proofed. And of course, that's without certainty, but I want to offer three, and they're drawn from reflections from Professor Goldsmith, and they're about perhaps pushing on the lenses or the metaphors or the way of looking, not just so that it can assist right now in 2015, but this is an ongoing political discussion and can help us have the tools to think about it. So there's three. The first one. Professor Goldsmith speaks about the idea of balance. Now, he specifically sort of considers the idea of secrecy or trust versus metadata and surveillance. But in the literature, and as we've seen in the course in general, that metaphor of balance is everywhere. It dominates how we think about this. We think about it, on one hand, security, and on the other hand, well, you can place the value that you're thinking about, that's dear to you, liberty, international human rights, whatever it may be. Is that idea of balance a good metaphor for that future? Is that the most useful? And I just want to, not critique, but perhaps just push on. I want to suggest a different metaphor. I want you to imagine the following. And it's one that draws very deeply on the idea of movement, future, construction. There are two people walking. One has a security frame. That's the way that they see metadata and surveillance. One perhaps has an international human rights framework. And they're walking along a path. And for a long time, they're in agreement. There are threats. There is the need for some degree of surveillance. There are real issues to be grappled with, technological developments. But then at one point, the security person, woman, sits down. The international human rights frame, however, continues to walk because theirs is an unknown future. What actually is security? What will be the contribution of the individual to the construction of an unknown future? International human rights in the backpack absorbs the idea of security. It sees that need as legitimate. It sees the need in this backpack that it's walking with for some degree of surveillance, but it keeps walking. It's an unknown and untested future. And what is the contribution that that gives for the future? Well, it insists on a role for the individual, on a political role in constructing and walking on that path. So, the first observation I'd like to make is to replace the metaphor of balance with one of movement. A security framework is more static, and an international human rights framework, at least from the readings and the experts that I've seen, has inherently that movement and the political agency of the individual to construct a future while still dealing with security needs. The second point I want to speak about from Professor Goldsmith is the idea of character and the idea of culture within surveillance. He says towards the end of his interview that it matters. It matters who's in there. I want to push that on a little more as well to future-proof that metaphor. The fact that it matters is not just a fate. It's not that I happen to work under a good boss, I happen to work under a bad boss, I happen to have people with good judgments. Goodness is created. We have to see the culture of surveillance and surveillance bodies as a public interest. How do we do that? What does that look like? Well, we covered that in our weeks where we drew on Frank Morehouse's idea of seeing dissent as honourable. The idea of the good character in the surveillance organisation, which Professor Goldsmith speaks of, is not just one of happenstance or fate. It is created, and therefore we have to see that as an element of a responsibility of a society to insist that internal dissent is seen as honourable. And the third metaphor, or future-proofing of a metaphor, is this idea of dots. Dots are either implicitly, Professor Goldsmith doesn't specifically refer to it, but it's this idea of connections, dots. We spoke about the idea from Professor Schneier about the illusion sometimes of connections in our week, the theatre of security. And we said that these dots and these connections need to be real, that we need to see evidence of them, that that's actually working, and that's part of transparency. But I don't think that does enough for future-proofing the imagery of dots. It's more to it than that. What dots are we connecting, and why? Dots are not neutral. What might it look like, for example, if I looked to the metadata, the dots, as it were, of sites of my own violence, and I looked to see connections? Did that bring peace? What if I looked at the dots, for example, of violence against women, where that happens, why, systemically, and made more connections? And perhaps that's where I'll leave you. Perhaps this is a great opportunity. Perhaps surveillance, metadata, the dots that we're beginning to see are the politics of the future. And the real question is, what dots are we going to connect?